Good morning. It's Monday, November 4th, one day before Election Day. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 395 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. The drones just keep coming out of Lebanon into Israel. More damage, more injuries, and more deaths. Yet another Iranian attack against Israel is likely on the way. And Israel now assesses that roughly half the hostages in Gaza are dead. All of this comes just as we get ready to vote here in the United States. And one gets a sense that the lame duck period between Election Day tomorrow, November 5th, and Inauguration Day, January 20th, could see a lot of action. It's a dangerous time right now for Israel, but it's also dangerous for Iran. The White House just warned the regime that it will no longer be able to restrain Israel if the regime attacks again. Lots to track here, but thankfully, that's exactly what we do here at the FDD Morning Brief every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so keep tuning in. Today's guest is actually a recent guest on the FDD Morning Brief. Joining us as a repeat offender is Ilan Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council. Ilan recently published a new study on the Iranian opposition and the ways in which Washington should engage with its assorted factions. Ilan spent more than a year researching and writing this report. I'm happy to say that he'll break it down for us in just a few minutes right here on the FDD Morning Brief. The war between Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran is out of the shadows. The regime is signaling a counterstrike on Israel. Reports suggest that an attack could come out of Iraq, where the regime has placed short-range ballistic missiles. That strike could come as soon as tonight. The messaging from Washington has been rather good. The White House has dispatched B-52 bombers to the region. These aircraft can drop some serious ordnance on high-value targets from high elevations. Meanwhile, Israel has already wrecked much of the regime's air defenses. The White House also warned the regime that it won't restrain the Israelis as it has since Iran first fired missiles and drones at Israel back in April. The message is stark: stand down or face the consequences. The regime, however, remains defiant. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei continues to bare his teeth. Regime officials are even hinting at a dash to a nuclear bomb. The disparate storms we've been watching for years here at FDD may be gathering for a final showdown of sorts. America and Israel have long prepared for this moment, individually and together. That's the good news. The bad news: the regime may want a full-blown war, and that includes all of its proxies. The only prominent figure looking for an off-ramp right now appears to be the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian. I doubt he has enough juice. With the path that we're on, it's going to take more than one man to bring this thing to a soft landing. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Israeli Special Forces captured a senior Hezbollah operative in an amphibious raid in northern Lebanon. This was an unusual operation. Commandos from the IDF's elite Shayetet 13 naval unit landed at the coastal Lebanese city of Batroun, raided a seaside chalet, nabbed a Hezbollah operative, and exited the area via speedboats. This all went down some 87 miles north of the Israeli border and reportedly took less than 5 minutes. Who is this Hezbollahi? His name is Imad Ahmaz, and he's a member of Hezbollah's naval force. Israeli commandos brought him back to Israel, where he'll reportedly be questioned by military intelligence. According to the IDF, Ahmaz is a significant source of knowledge. If you ask me, the Israelis may have staged this as a way to extract an intelligence asset. I think this guy was spying for Israel, but that's just my hunch. We'll have to wait and see. Headline 2, the IDF eliminated senior Hamas official Izzadin Kassab. Kassab was taken out in an airstrike in southern Gaza. This guy served as head of Hamas's national relations, which means that he coordinated between Hamas and other terrorist groups in Gaza. According to the IDF, Kassab was high enough in Hamas's chain of command to have the authority to greenlight attacks. Kassab was among Hamas's last remaining officials in Gaza. By and large, the rest of Hamas's Politburo is located in, wait for it, Qatar. I continue to say the Biden administration can end this war if it would just put pressure on the Qataris to put the remaining Hamas leaders under house arrest, get them to surrender publicly, and call for the release of their remaining hostages. It's so simple, and yet the White House continues to handle Doha with kid gloves. Why? And headline 3. The Houthis have inflicted some serious damage on international shipping. According to Danish shipping giant AP Moller Maersk, the Suez Canal will remain a no-go zone for commercial ships through at least mid-2025. That's a problem, considering that roughly 12% of global trade normally passes through the Suez every year. And it makes you wonder, why are the Egyptians not howling about this every single day? The Suez Canal is their top moneymaker. Something just doesn't add up. But back to the Houthis, the group continues to terrorize the Red Sea with impunity. In September, Maersk reported that commercial traffic through the Suez had dropped 66% since the company began diverting ships away from the Red Sea. Inexplicably, the United States and its allies have refused to impose order in this critical waterway. Maersk and others have been forced to reroute ships around Africa to avoid attacks from the Iran-backed rebels. Okay, it's now my pleasure to welcome Ilan Berman. Ilan is Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington. He's a longtime friend of mine, a recent guest on the program, and an all-around great guy. He's been hard at work for the last year on a report that takes a close look at the Iranian opposition. And as you've heard for months, now on this program and probably in a lot of other places, the best weapon we have in bringing down the Iranian regime are its people. They despise the Islamic Republic even more than we do. So with that introduction, let's invite Ilan Berman onto the show. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief, Ilan Berman.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right, let's get into it. Let's start with that new report. Tell us about it. What was the goal in writing it? What were you trying to achieve here?
Well, no, and I think the proper frame to begin to think about it is that as our mutual friend, as your colleague Cliff May says, in order to sell somebody aspirin, you first have to convince them that they have a headache. And we are well and truly in the headache stage of our discussion about the Islamic Republic. We understand that the regime is a threat. We understand that the regime is a revisionist state, and that it is likely to, through the actions that it takes, through the ideology that it espouses, is likely to lead to all sorts of instability in the region. What we don't have a good sense of yet, and this is what the report is trying to solve for, is a really granular understanding, not just of the terrain of the Iranian opposition. The Iranian opposition is very vast, it's very variegated. There's lots of different groups that are oscillating around the discussion about post-theocratic Iran. But also, what are the prerequisites for the United States? What are the principles that these groups should espouse, ideally, to align a future Iran with American national security interests? So I spent a good deal of time in closed-door workshops, in interviews, in private conversations with subject matter experts, also with former administration officials from various administrations, to try to get the full plurality of the view about what relating to territory, what relating to political composition, what relating to the nuclear program would, what's the consensus view? What's the most important thing? Or things that the future Iranian government in waiting should espouse in order to be a dependable, a transparent, and a moderate ally of the United States.
All right, interesting. So what is the current state of the Iranian opposition? How can they help the United States?
Well, no, and to start, you have to understand that the Iranian opposition is actually, there are two wings, right? There's the opposition inside the country, and there's the opposition outside the country. The opposition inside the country, you see a lot about, because they're the ones, in terms of media coverage, they're the ones that are protesting. They're the ones that are at the front lines of resistance against the regime. But they're far less organized than the groups that are outside, because the regime is right on top of them. The regime is preventing their political organization. The regime is repressing them. The regime is killing them or imprisoning them. The groups that are outside of the country in the Iranian diaspora, including in the United States, have much greater freedom of action. And so they organize much more. So you hear about that second group, the group that is closer to us, the group that has greater freedom to move around, more than you do about the opposition elements that are inside the country. But the ones inside the country are arguably more decisive, because they're the ones that are actually on the front lines. They're the ones that have to have the political will in order for us to see change.
Interesting. All right. Well, now for, I think, maybe the most important question. What are the things that we can do to help the opposition? As we always say, they're the best chance that we have of bringing down the regime. So what can we do for them? I guess I'm asking for both the ones that are inside the country and outside. I guess we've got to have two different strategies, but how do we approach this?
We do have to have two different strategies, but I think it starts with the old Hippocratic oath that doctors take, right? The first thing that you have to do is do no harm. Right. So a perennial question that comes up every single time you talk to the Iranian opposition is the question of territorial integrity, of whether or not Iran, which is multiple empires, right, has a long imperial history spanning over a millennia, and the contours of the Persian Empire, depending on which iteration of it you're looking at, have ebbed and flowed. But the aggregate result is that the Islamic Republic now is actually a agglomeration of all these different ethnic groups, all these different languages, all these different religions, and political perspectives. And so the question that always comes up is, would a future Iran, would the West, would the United States specifically be best served by it breaking apart, it balkanizing the way we saw in the Balkans, we saw during the Kosovo Wars in the 1990s, or do we want it to stay together? We know what the Iranians want, right? The Iranians, because of their imperial history, they want this all to stay together because of their self-identity, because of their strategic culture. But what I found really surprising is in my conversations with U.S. national security professionals, I got the same response for a very different reason. And national security professionals, particularly those that work on, for example, the nuclear program, were pretty adamant that a future Iran, a post-theocratic Iran, whatever happens, has to remain fully in control of its borders for a very simple reason. The nuclear program is very mature. And what we saw historically after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a very short-lived but a very dangerous period where you saw a loose nuke scenario all over the territory of the former Soviet Union, right? The scholar Rensselaer Lee even wrote a book about it. It's called Smuggling Armageddon. It's really a nightmare scenario. And that scenario, thankfully, was averted. But it has left government officials in the United States very, very leery of the idea that a loss of central control in a future Iran could lead to a repeat of that scenario. So that's just one indicator of how we should start thinking about what we should ask. Right? Because frankly, this is a conversation. It's a conversation between us and the Iranian opposition, these groups both inside the country, but even elements, groups outside the country, but even elements inside the country. We should be telling them the things that we need to see, right? That doesn't mean that they should stop what they're doing if they don't align with us. But it does mean that we can lend our support, including political support, including economic support for their protests, for communications equipment, sort of all sorts of the sort of things. But we have to do it strategically to those groups that espouse our interests, our national security prerogatives.
Interesting. And of course, talking about that nuclear program, we've seen indications just over the last weekend, the regime officials close to the supreme leader, they're now hinting at a possible dash to a bomb. This is the first time where they've, I think, openly flirted with this, and they've been almost bragging about it over the last couple of days. What's your assessment? Do you think we're right on the precipice here? Do you think they're going to do it? How do you assess where we are?
Right. No, and I think we're on the precipice of that and more to come, because ultimately, right, the adversary also gets a vote. So what you've seen in recent weeks has been this pretty catastrophic, from Iran's perspective, erosion of Iranian strategic credibility. The Israelis have really done a number on Iran's principal terrorist proxy, Hezbollah. The Israeli reprisal strike on territorial Iran was more limited than many people, including myself, had expected, and yet very impactful, because it really sort of popped the lid off of the air defense architecture that Iran has to protect its nuclear program. But the Iranian regime now has to figure out its next moves. And I know we're focusing on whether or not they're going to attack Israel. I think that's a separate conversation. I think strategically, the regime is thinking about three things, and I think you're likely to see them move out on three things simultaneously. The first is military modernization, because historically they have the conventional force strength that they've had has really taken a backseat to these asymmetric capabilities, ballistic missiles and drones and proxies. And I think in the aftermath of the Israeli strike, you're going to see a lot of Iranian investment. In fact, the regime just a few days ago announced that they were going to increase their defense budget for the coming year by 300%. That's an indication that they are trying to recapitalize their conventional forces, including their air defense forces. The second thing that I think you're going to see is you're going to see a massive wave of repression against the Iranian opposition, because the regime is rickety, and the regime has a tremendous loss of ideological credibility. And all of this, by the way, is happening irrespective of the now hot war between Israel and Iran. You have declining religiosity, you have economic malaise. All of this is a pretty heady cocktail within the Islamic Republic. Now that we've popped the lid off of the perceived invulnerability of Iran's nuclear program and even of its regime legitimacy or regime stability, potentially, the regime really wants to make sure that the opposition doesn't get any crazy ideas. So I think you're likely to see a wave of repression rivaling or exceeding what we've seen over the last couple of years really take hold in the near term. And the third is exactly what you said, this sprint towards the bomb. And we've focused for a long time on how Iran is inching out of its obligations under the 2015 JCPOA, how Iran is making these incremental gains and salami slicing its way towards a nuclear status. But I think time is not working for the regime. I think increasingly the regime is looking at the fact that its nuclear program is defenseless. The regime is going to pick a fight with the Israelis. It has already picked a fight, but I think it's going to pick a bigger fight. And so speed is of the essence. And so I think you're very likely to see an acceleration of the nuclear program with all of that, all that portends.
Scary stuff. I want to ask you just specifically, we keep hearing about a possible Iranian strike on Israel, this back and forth now that I think is maybe the new normal, and that it could come as soon as tonight or this week. What is your sense of what's coming, the timing? What do you think the Iranians are going to do? Is it just going to be more of the same, more ballistic missiles, something different?
It's a tricky question because I very likely am going to be proven wrong. But if I had to assess from right now, from Monday morning, my sense would be that it's going to come slightly later rather than sooner, because I think if you're an Iranian decision maker, you don't get any brownie points for moving quickly. I would much rather wait, even if it's a day or two or three or four, wait to see the results of the U.S. election and wait to see what the strategic terrain in the Middle East is likely to look like over the next few months before you move, because context is everything. And do you want to wait until the environment is slightly more favorable to you? Do you want to wait when U.S. troops have now retracted again over the horizon? Or are you likely to uncork a larger conflict in which the United States really bears down in support of Israel in a demonstrable way? My sense is that for the Iranians, I know they want to move fast and they want to signal resolve, but it may make sense for them to wait a beat.
All right, last question for you. I know you track Russia. You're a Russian speaker. What are you seeing right now in terms of Russian-Iranian cooperation? Are you worried about those trend lines?
Right. Yeah, I am. And I'm actually very worried about what it does for Israeli policy. So all your viewers know that what we've seen over the last year and a half or so has been Iran really wading wholesale into the largest continental war in Europe in 80 years. Through the provision of drones, through the provision of military materiel to the government of Vladimir Putin. What is less well understood, but frankly, even more strategically significant, is that on the back of all these military deliveries, there's been this massive expansion of strategic ties between Moscow and Tehran. And over the next week or so, week and a half, the Russians and the Iranians are planning to sign a new framework strategic accord, which will include military coordination. And that may be nothing. It may be vaporware. It may be just sort of symbolic. But my sense is that it causes all sorts of problems, because what you have now, up until now, has been an Israeli government that's really tried to thread the needle. They have, after October 7th, I think, become very much aware that they and the Ukrainians are fighting a common fight, that there is an interconnectedness between the two fronts. But you haven't really seen the Israeli government move out against the Russian government in a material sense. because the Russian government remains involved with Syria to Israel's north, because the Russian government is a big fish. And that's maybe not a fight that Israel wants to pick. But this may be unavoidable if the Russians and the Iranians move closer into strategic alignment. And more importantly, if the Russians become an active player in this wider war that Iran is trying to start in the Middle East. So I think we have to watch this space, but I don't think it's trending in a good direction.
No, definitely not. All right, we're going to leave it on that sour note. Thank you for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief, Ilan Berman.
My pleasure.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Check out the Biden administration foreign policy tracker, in which my colleagues track the ups and downs of the administration's policies across all the issues that we cover here at our think tank. The product is edited by my colleague John Hardy, and it's a good monthly product from FDD to keep tabs on how things are trending worldwide. And yes, in case you're wondering, this will soon be a Trump administration or Harris administration foreign policy tracker. We continue to call balls and strikes no matter who sits at the Resolute desk. My colleague Jacob Nagel has teamed up with Boaz Golani, a professor at Israel's Technion University, for a fascinating piece in the national interest. The pair underscore the troubling developments of 10,000 elite North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine. They were trained by Putin's army to join the Russian offensive. The move obviously signals a growing desperation on Putin's part, but as they rightly note, the more desperate he becomes, the greater the risk that he might resort to rash and dangerous measures to achieve his war objectives. Yikes. And finally, my colleague Jonathan Saya has penned a piece for FDD's Long War Journal on the Islamic Republic's accelerating intelligence operations in Israel, with at least 5 spy rings uncovered by Jerusalem in October alone. Tehran deploys cyber weapons and direct human intelligence collectors in its multifaceted espionage efforts. Jonathan expertly unravels all of it. I recommend checking out his analysis, but be forewarned, this is some scary stuff. I don't recommend reading this too close to bedtime. That's it for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please do support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. I hope you'll join us for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief on Wednesday. Our guest will be Boris Zilberman. He's a former colleague of mine at FDD, now at Christians United for Israel. He's a government relations specialist, which means he'll be able to break down the results of the elections and what they mean for the war in the Middle East. Should be a timely one. We hope to see you next time. Thanks again for joining. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.